The Wyoming wind howled like a banshee through Devil's Canyon as Tom McCarthy pulled his collar tight against the driving snow. 3 years of grief had carved deep lines into his weathered face, and his failing ranch stood as empty as his heart. But when he spotted a huddled figure nearly buried in a snowdrift, clutching something precious against the storm, Tom faced a choice that would echo through eternity. Sometimes the smallest act of mercy can ignite the greatest miracles, and what this desperate woman whispered to him would resurrect not just his dying ranch, but his will to live. Subscribe now to witness how one man's final blanket became the thread that wove together an entire community's destiny. The blizzard of 1887 struck Wyoming territory with the fury of 10 winters compressed into one merciless night. Thomas McCarthy urged his tired gelding through drifts that reached the horse's belly, each step a battle against nature's wrath. The wind shrieked across the barren landscape, carrying with it the promise of death for any soul caught unprepared. Tom pulled his worn coat tighter, feeling the bite of cold seep through fabric that had seen too many harsh seasons. At 45, he looked older. Grief had a way of aging a man beyond his years. His weathered hands, cracked from years of ranch work, gripped the reins with practiced ease despite the numbness creeping into his fingers. The small cabin he called home was still 2 miles ahead, a meager shelter in this vast wilderness that had become his prison since Sarah and Daniel died. 3 years, 3 long years since typhoid fever had stolen his wife and 8-year-old son, leaving him alone with nothing but bitter memories and a failing cattle ranch. The 20 head of cattle he'd managed to keep alive this winter huddled somewhere in the southern pasture, hopefully finding shelter behind the rock outcropping near Silver Creek. Tomorrow he'd have to check on them, assuming he survived this night. The gelding suddenly shied, nearly throwing Tom from the saddle. "Easy, boy," he murmured, patting the horse's neck. "What's got you spooked?" That's when he saw her, a dark shape against the white expanse, barely visible through the swirling snow. At first, he thought it might be a fallen tree or scattered rocks, but something about the form made him dismount and wade through the knee-deep snow for a closer look. His heart nearly stopped when he realized what lay before him. A woman, curled in a desperate ball against the base of a windswept pine, her dark hair plastered against her face by ice and snow. Her lips were blue, her breathing shallow and labored. But what made Tom's blood run cold was the small bundle clutched protectively against her chest. A baby, wrapped in what appeared to be a thin shawl, both mother and child on the very edge of death. "Ma'am!" Tom dropped to his knees beside her, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" The woman's eyes fluttered open, dark brown like rich coffee, filled with a desperate plea. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. Tom could see she was young, perhaps in her 20s, with the delicate features and olive complexion that spoke of Mexican heritage. Her clothes were little more than rags, soaked through and offering no protection against the killing cold. Without hesitation, Tom began unbuttoning his coat. Beneath it, he wore the threadbare wool blanket that had been Sarah's, the last thing that carried her scent, her warmth. He'd wrapped himself in it every night for 3 years, the only comfort he had left in this world. His fingers hesitated for just a moment at the worn edges, remembering Sarah's hands mending a tear in the corner just days before she fell ill. The baby's weak cry cut through his hesitation like a knife. Tom pulled the blanket free and wrapped it around both mother and child, lifting them as gently as he could manage. The woman was lighter than she should have been, too light, speaking of hunger and hardship that had preceded this frozen nightmare. "I've got you," he whispered, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "Both of you. You're going to be all right." The woman's eyes met his, and in that moment something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, of one soul acknowledging another's fundamental goodness. Her cracked lips formed a single word: "Gracias." Tom carried them to his horse, his muscles straining against the wind and cold. Getting them both onto the gelding while maintaining his grip on the reins proved nearly impossible, but desperation lent him strength he didn't know he possessed. With the woman cradled against his chest and the baby nestled between them, he guided the horse toward home through the blinding storm. The 2-mile journey felt like 20. Several times Tom thought they might not make it. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness, and the baby's cries grew weaker. His own body screamed in protest against the cold that seemed to seep into his very bones. But he pressed on, driven by something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. When the dim outline of his cabin finally emerged through the snow, Tom nearly wept with relief. The structure wasn't much: 4 rooms built from rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney that drew poorly and windows that let in too much cold. But it was shelter, and shelter meant life. He kicked open the door and carried his charges inside, immediately moving to the stone fireplace where cold ashes waited. With hands that shook from more than just cold, he built a fire, coaxing flames from kindling and prayers. The woman and child lay on his bed, the same bed where Sarah had breathed her last, wrapped in his wife's blanket. As warmth began to fill the small room, the woman's breathing steadied. The baby, a girl, Tom realized, opened dark eyes that seemed far too wise for an infant. She couldn't be more than a few months old, yet she studied Tom's face with an intensity that unnerved him. "There now," he murmured, stoking the fire higher. "You're safe, both of you." He heated water in his only pot, making weak broth from the last of his salt pork and some dried beans. It wasn't much, but it was warm and nourishing. When he turned back to the bed, he found the woman awake, watching him with those coffee-dark eyes. "Maria," she whispered, touching her chest. Then, indicating the baby, "Isabella." "Tom," he replied, offering her the warm cup. "Tom McCarthy." She struggled to sit up, accepting the broth with hands that trembled. As she sipped, color slowly returned to her cheeks. The baby, Isabella, seemed stronger too, her cries more vigorous. "We were traveling north," Maria said in accented but clear English. "My husband, he died, the consumption. I had nowhere else to go, no family. I thought perhaps in Cheyenne." Her voice trailed off, the futility of her situation evident in her expression. Tom nodded, understanding the desperation that drove people to impossible journeys. "The storm came up sudden. You couldn't have known." Maria looked down at the blanket wrapped around her and her daughter. Her fingers traced the careful stitches along one edge and her eyes widened. "This blanket," she whispered, her voice filled with something Tom couldn't identify. "The initials here. SM, Sarah McCarthy." Tom's breath caught. How could she possibly know Sarah's name? "Senor McCarthy," Maria continued, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. 3 years ago, at the mission hospital in Santa Fe, there was an angel who held my grandmother's hand as she died. A woman with golden hair and the kindest blue eyes, who spoke Spanish, learned from books but delivered with such love. She gave my grandmother her own blanket when the fever took hold, stayed with her through that last night when the doctor said there was nothing more to be done. The cup slipped from Tom's suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering on the wooden floor. Tom stared at Maria as if she were a ghost, his weathered face draining of color. The broken pottery at his feet mirrored the fragments of the life he thought he'd known, a life that was about to be rewritten by a woman he'd pulled from the jaws of death. "That's impossible," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Sarah never traveled to Santa Fe. She was here on the ranch when she and Daniel fell ill. The doctor from Laramie said, 'No, senor.'" Maria's voice was gentle but firm, her dark eyes filled with compassion. "Your wife, she was not sick when she came to the mission. She was searching for something, someone." Tom's legs gave out, and he collapsed into the single wooden chair beside the fireplace. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face, but they couldn't warm the ice that had suddenly formed around his heart. "Tell me," he managed. "Tell me everything." Maria adjusted Isabella against her chest, the baby now sleeping peacefully in the warmth of Sarah's blanket. It was October of 1884. "I was caring for my grandmother, who had come to the mission when the fever took hold of her mind. The nuns, they did what they could, but..." She shook her head sadly. "Your Sarah, she appeared like an angel of mercy, not as a patient, but as someone seeking answers." The wind outside howled against the cabin walls, but inside the only sound was the crackling of the fire and Tom's labored breathing. "She carried with her a small daguerreotype," Maria continued, "of a young woman who looked much like me, Mexican, with dark hair and kind eyes. She spoke to everyone, the nuns, the patients, the families who came to visit, always in that careful Spanish of hers, asking if anyone had seen this woman." Tom's mind reeled. He knew that daguerreotype. It had belonged to his father, kept hidden in a wooden box in the barn. The woman in the picture had haunted his childhood, a mysterious figure his father would stare at during his drinking binges, muttering words in Spanish that young Tom never understood. Who was she looking for? Tom asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Esperanza Morales, Maria replied softly. Your father's first wife. Your older sister's mother. The words hit Tom like a physical blow. Sister. He'd had a sister. His father, that bitter, broken man who died when Tom was 16, had never spoken of a first marriage, a first family. Only during his worst drunken rages had he ever mentioned the woman who took my heart to Mexico and never brought it back. My grandmother knew Esperanza, Maria continued, her voice growing stronger as she saw Tom's desperate need for the truth. They had been friends as children in a small village outside Santa Fe. When your father came through with a cattle drive in 1840, he fell in love with Esperanza's beauty and spirit. They married in the mission church, and she bore him a daughter, Catalina. Tom gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. What happened to them? The fever, Maria said simply. The same fever that took your wife and son. It swept through the territory like wildfire in 1842. Esperanza and little Catalina both died within days of each other. Your father, he was destroyed. He left Santa Fe and never returned, carrying only that daguerreotype and a heart full of grief. Suddenly, so many pieces of Tom's childhood fell into place. His father's drinking, his rage, the way he'd sometimes look at Tom's mother with an expression that wasn't quite love, as if she were a replacement for something irreplaceable. The Spanish words he'd mutter, Perdóname, Esperanza. Perdóname, mi niña. Forgive me, Esperanza. Forgive me, my little girl. But why was Sarah looking for them? Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because of the fever that took your son, Maria replied, tears streaming down her face. Your Sarah. She had heard your father's drunken confessions, had pieced together the truth. She thought perhaps there were other relatives, other family members who had survived. She wanted to find them, to tell them about you, about Daniel. She thought if she could reunite your father's two families, somehow it might heal the curse that seemed to follow the men in your bloodline. Tom stood abruptly, pacing to the window, where snow continued to pile against the glass. She left because of some superstition, some idea about a family curse? Not superstition, senor. Maria's voice was firm. Love. She left because she loved you and Daniel so much that she was willing to travel hundreds of miles to risk everything, to break what she saw as a pattern of loss and abandonment that had haunted your family for generations. The room fell silent, except for the fire's whisper and Isabella's soft breathing. Tom pressed his forehead against the cold window, his breath fogging the glass. She never came home, he said finally. The typhoid fever found her at the mission, Maria explained gently. She had been there for days caring for the sick, including my grandmother. The nuns said she worked tirelessly as if she were trying to heal all the world's suffering with her own hands. When the fever took hold of her, she was already weakened from exhaustion and exposure. Tom turned back to face Maria, his eyes red with unshed tears. Did she say anything? About me? About Daniel? Maria nodded, shifting Isabella to her other arm. She spoke of you constantly. How you were the kindest man she'd ever known. How you'd built your ranch with your own hands to give her and Daniel a good life. How you sang to Daniel when he had nightmares, even though you claimed you couldn't carry a tune. She said you were nothing like your father, that you had broken the cycle of bitterness and abandonment just by being the man you chose to be. The tears Tom had been holding back for 3 years finally came, falling freely down his weathered cheeks. I thought she'd abandoned us. When they brought me the news that she'd died in Santa Fe, I couldn't understand why she'd been there. The doctor said she must have been running away, that the stress of ranch life had driven her to seek escape. No, mi amigo, Maria said softly. She was running toward something, toward hope, toward healing for the man she loved more than her own life. Tom wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, looking at this woman who had brought him the greatest gift imaginable, the truth about his wife's final act of love. She died holding my grandmother's hand, Maria continued, but her last words were about you and Daniel. She made my grandmother promise that if she ever met a man named Thomas McCarthy from Wyoming Territory, she would tell him that Sarah's love for him was stronger than death itself. that he should not let grief turn him into his father. Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, though snow continued to fall steadily. Inside the warm cabin, wrapped in Sarah's blanket, holding her own child close, Maria delivered the message that would change everything. She said you were the best man she'd ever known, and that somewhere in this vast territory there were people who needed that goodness. She said you shouldn't hide from the world, but should open your heart to it just as you had opened your heart to her. Tom looked at Maria and Isabella, at this woman and child he'd saved from certain death, and for the first time in 3 years he felt something other than grief stirring in his chest. It felt like purpose. Dawn broke clear and cold across the Wyoming landscape, the storm having exhausted itself during the night. Tom stood at his cabin window, watching the sun paint the snow-covered plains in shades of gold and rose. Behind him, Maria nursed Isabella, while humming a soft Spanish lullaby that filled the small space with unexpected warmth. The revelation about Sarah had changed something fundamental in Tom's heart. The bitter isolation he'd wrapped around himself like armor was beginning to crack, letting in light he'd forgotten could exist. But with that light came a terrible clarity about the state of his ranch, his life, and the harsh realities facing Maria and her infant daughter. "I need to check on my cattle," Tom said, pulling on his coat. "Make yourself at home. There's more dried beans in the cupboard and some jerky if you're still hungry." Maria looked up from nursing Isabella, concern evident in her dark eyes. "You're a good man, Senor McCarthy. Sarah chose well." Tom paused at the door, those words hitting him harder than any physical blow could have. "She deserved better than what I gave her, better than this dying ranch and a husband too proud to see what was right in front of him." "Perhaps," Maria said gently, "but she also deserved to have her sacrifice mean something. She died trying to heal your family's wounds. Don't let that death be in vain." Tom nodded curtly and stepped into the crisp morning air. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he made his way to the barn, where his gelding waited patiently for its morning feed. As he saddled the horse, his mind churned with possibilities and problems in equal measure. The harsh truth was that the ranch was failing. He'd lost most of his herd to disease and harsh winters, and the remaining 20 head barely provided enough income to keep him in basic supplies. The mortgage payments to the Territorial Bank in Laramie were 3 months behind, and his credit at Henderson's General Store had run dry weeks ago. He had perhaps a month before the bank foreclosed on the property his father had claimed 30 years earlier. But now he had 2 additional mouths to feed, one of them an infant who needed far more than dried beans and jerky. Maria would need proper food, warm clothes, and eventually a way to support herself and Isabella. The nearest town was Sweetwater, 15 miles south, barely more than a collection of ramshackle buildings around a train depot. It offered few opportunities for a single Mexican woman with a baby. Tom guided his horse through the knee-deep drifts toward the southern pasture, following the fence line his father had built with such pride decades earlier. Many of the posts were rotting, the wire sagging or broken entirely. Another expense he couldn't afford. He found his cattle clustered behind the rock outcropping, just as he'd hoped. They were thin but alive, their breath steaming in the cold air as they poured through snow to reach the sparse grass beneath. As he counted heads, a movement on the ridge above caught his attention. 3 riders sat their horses at the crest of Devil's Ridge, too far away to make out clearly but close enough to know they were watching him. Tom's hand instinctively moved to the rifle scabbard on his saddle. In his grief-induced isolation, he'd lost touch with the subtle currents of territorial politics, but those riders felt like trouble. When he looked again, they were gone. Tom spent the morning breaking ice on the stock pond and distributing the last of his hay, his mind wrestling with impossible calculations. Even if he could somehow make the mortgage payment, even if the spring brought good grass and healthy calves, the ranch would barely support 1 person, let alone 3. On the ride back to the cabin, he spotted fresh horse tracks in the snow. Several horses, all shod, heading east toward Laramie. The tracks were too recent to be from before the storm, which meant riders had passed his property sometime during the night or early morning. The hair on the back of his neck prickled with unease. He found Maria standing in his doorway, Isabella cradled in her arms, both of them silhouetted against the warm light spilling from the cabin. For a moment the sight stopped him short. It looked so much like the homecoming he'd dreamed of during his lonely years, so much like the family he'd lost. There were men here, Maria said without preamble as he approached. 4 of them, maybe 5. They came while you were gone, but they didn't dismount. Just sat their horses and looked at the cabin for a long time. Tom's jaw tightened. Did they say anything, make any demands? No, but one of them, a big man with a black beard. He kept pointing at the barn and talking to the others. I couldn't hear the words, but the tone... She shivered, and it wasn't from the cold. I've heard that tone before when men talk about taking what isn't theirs. Tom dismounted and unsaddled his horse, his movements sharp with controlled anger. He'd been so focused on his grief, so isolated in his self-pity, that he'd failed to notice the vultures circling. But now, with Maria and Isabella depending on him, he couldn't afford such blindness. Tell me about these men, he said, leading his horse into the barn. The one with the beard, he wore a badge. Deputy sheriff, maybe. The others looked like ranch hands, but well armed. They kept looking at the cabin like they were measuring it for a coffin. Tom's blood ran cold. He knew exactly who Maria had described. Deputy Frank Morrison, Territorial Bank's unofficial enforcer, a man who'd made a career out of helping the bank acquire properties for far less than their actual value. Rumors had circulated for years about Morrison's methods, how families who couldn't make their payments would suddenly face trumped-up charges, how their cattle would mysteriously disappear, how accidents would befall anyone who resisted too strenuously. We need to go to town, Tom said grimly. Today. Senor McCarthy, if there's trouble, there's already trouble, Tom interrupted. The kind that grows worse if you ignore it. I've been hiding out here feeling sorry for myself while wolves circled my property. But I'll be damned if I let them take what Sarah died trying to save. They hitched Tom's rickety wagon and made the journey to Sweetwater in tense silence, Isabella sleeping peacefully despite the bone-jarring ride over frozen ruts. The town looked even more dismal than Tom remembered, a handful of buildings struggling against the wind, most of them showing the grey weathering that spoke of dreams deferred and hope abandoned. Henderson's General Store occupied the corner of Main and Railroad Streets, its false front decorated with peeling paint and optimistic signs advertising goods that hadn't been available for months. Tom helped Maria down from the wagon, noting how the few townspeople they encountered watched them with barely concealed curiosity. Inside the store, old Pete Henderson looked up from his ledger with the expression of a man who'd grown tired of extending credit to people who might never pay it back. Tom McCarthy, Pete said neutrally. Been a while. Pete, Tom touched the brim of his hat. I need supplies. Food for a woman and baby, some proper winter clothes, and I need information. Pete's roomy eyes fixed on Maria and Isabella, taking in their obvious need and Tom's protective stance. Information costs extra these days, as do supplies for folks whose accounts are already stretched thin. Tom reached into his coat and pulled out his father's pocket watch, the only thing of value he owned besides the ranch itself. This should cover what we need, with enough left over for answers. Pete examined the watch with the practiced eye of a man who'd accepted countless items in trade over the years. This'll do. What kind of answers you looking for? The kind that explain why Deputy Morrison and his boys were scouting my property this morning. Pete's expression darkened. Ah, hell, Tom, you really don't know, do you? The truth, when it came, hit Tom like a physical blow. He gripped the edge of Henderson's counter as Pete Henderson laid out the ugly reality that had been unfolding, while Tom grieved in isolation. The Territorial Bank's been bought out, Pete explained in a low voice, glancing nervously toward the store's front window. New ownership came in from back east about 6 months ago, company called Western Development Corporation. They've been systematically foreclosing on every ranch and homestead they can get their hands on, then selling the land to the railroad for 10 times what they paid. Maria shifted Isabella to her other arm, her dark eyes fixed on Pete's weathered face. And Deputy Morrison works for them? Morrison works for whoever pays him, Pete replied bitterly. Used to be. He'd at least pretend to follow the law. Now he doesn't bother with pretense. Families who resist foreclosure find their cattle missing, their barns mysteriously catching fire, their wells poisoned. The Hendersons lost their spread 2 months ago after their youngest boy had an accident with a rattlesnake that somehow found its way into their root cellar. Tom's hands clenched into fists. How many families? 17 so far. The Johnsons, the Pattersons, Both Kowalski families, the widow Martinez and her boys. Pete's voice trailed off as he saw the growing fury in Tom's eyes. They're picking off the isolated ones first, the folks who don't have neighbors close enough to help. Your place has been on their list since the beginning, but they figured grief would do their work for them. They figured wrong, Tom said quietly, but there was steel in his voice that hadn't been there in years. Pete leaned across the counter, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. Tom, you need to understand what you're up against. This isn't just Morrison and a few hired guns. Western Development has backing from politicians in Cheyenne, maybe even Washington. They've got lawyers, money, and enough firepower to take whatever they want. Then why haven't they taken it already? Maria asked, bouncing Isabella gently as the baby began to fuss. Because they want it legal, Pete replied. Foreclosure is cleaner than murder, and it gives them clear title to sell to the railroad. But if Tom starts causing trouble, if he fights back... The old man shook his head grimly. Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring out the store's front window at the bleak street beyond. Snow had begun falling again, light flakes that danced in the cold wind. Finally, he turned back to Pete. I need you to spread the word, he said. Every displaced family, every rancher who's been forced off their land, every person who's been hurt by Morrison and his bosses, tell them Tom McCarthy is calling a meeting at his place tomorrow night. Tell them it's time to stand together or fall separately. Pete's eyes widened. Tom, that's suicide. Morrison will never let you get that far. Then we better make sure we're ready for him, Tom replied. He gathered the supplies Pete had set aside. Warm clothes for Maria, condensed milk and soft foods for Isabella, ammunition for his rifle. How much do I owe you? Consider it a loan, Pete said, pushing the pocket watch back across the counter. You'll need this more than I do before all this is over. The ride back to the ranch was tense, both Tom and Maria scanning the horizon for signs of trouble. The fresh snowfall made tracking easy, and Tom noted several sets of horse prints crossing and recrossing the road, Morrison's men most likely, keeping watch on everyone who'd been to town. You don't have to do this, Maria said as they approached the cabin. Isabella and we can find another way. There are missions, perhaps in Colorado or California. No, Tom said firmly. Sarah died trying to break the cycle of running away that's plagued my family for generations. I won't dishonor her memory by fleeing when people need help. That evening, as Maria prepared a simple meal from their new supplies, Tom cleaned his rifle and checked his ammunition. He had perhaps 30 rounds, enough for a small skirmish, but nowhere near sufficient for a prolonged fight. His father's old Colt revolver hung from its peg on the wall, loaded but untested for years. You know they'll come tonight, Maria said quietly, settling Isabella in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a wooden crate and lined with Sarah's blanket. I'm counting on it, Tom replied. Morrison's not stupid. He knows that once word spreads, once people start gathering, his job becomes much harder. He'll want to end this before it begins. Maria moved to the window, peering out into the gathering darkness. In Mexico, I saw what happens when good people stand against corruption. Sometimes they win. More often... She didn't finish the thought. More often they die, Tom said matter-of-factly. But sometimes dying for something is better than living for nothing. They didn't have to wait long. Around 10 o'clock, Maria spotted the first flicker of torches moving through the darkness. 6 points of light advancing across the snow-covered prairie toward the cabin. 6 men, Tom observed, taking position at the front window. Morrison's not taking any chances. Tom McCarthy, the deputy's voice boomed across the stillness. Come out with your hands visible. You're under arrest for harboring a fugitive and conspiracy to defraud the territorial government. Tom almost laughed at the absurdity of the charges, but Maria's sharp intake of breath reminded him that, absurd or not, these accusations could justify anything Morrison chose to do. What fugitive would that be, Morrison? Tom called back through the closed door. The Mexican woman. She's wanted for theft in Santa Fe, and you're wanted for attempting to organize illegal resistance to lawful foreclosure proceedings. Tom glanced at Maria, who shook her head emphatically. It's a lie, she whispered. I've never stolen anything in my life. Of course it's a lie, Tom replied. But Morrison doesn't need truth, just an excuse. The deputy's voice came again, closer now. You've got 1 minute to surrender, McCarthy. After that, we come in shooting. Tom made his decision. He'd spent 3 years running from life, hiding from pain, avoiding the responsibility that came with caring about other people. Sarah had died trying to heal his family's legacy of abandonment and cowardice. He wouldn't let her sacrifice be meaningless. "Maria," he said quietly, "take Isabella to the back room. Stay low, away from the windows." "What are you going to do?" Tom checked his rifle one final time, then moved to the door. "What I should have done 3 years ago, what Sarah would have wanted me to do." He threw open the door and stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually but ready. The 6 men had spread out in a semicircle around the cabin, their torches creating a ring of flickering light in the darkness. "I'm not surrendering to a corrupt deputy and his hired killers," Tom called out, his voice carrying clearly across the snow. "And I'm not letting you drive any more families off land that's rightfully theirs." Morrison spurred his horse forward, his bearded face twisted with anger. "You're outnumbered 6-1, McCarthy, last chance." "Maybe," Tom replied, "but I'm fighting for something worth dying for." "What are you fighting for, Morrison? A few dollars from Eastern businessmen who'll toss you aside the moment you're no longer useful?" Behind him, Tom heard the cabin door open softly. Maria's voice, strong and clear, cut through the night. "He's not alone." Tom glanced back to see Maria standing in the doorway, holding his father's Colt revolver with surprising familiarity. Her dark eyes blazed with determination. "My grandmother didn't die in vain at that mission," she said, her accented English carrying across the snow. "Your wife didn't die in vain trying to heal old wounds, and we won't let you destroy what they died to protect." Morrison's laugh was harsh and bitter. "2 against 6, you're both crazy." That's when the first shot rang out from the darkness beyond the torchlight, not aimed at Tom or Maria, but at one of Morrison's men, who tumbled from his saddle with a cry of pain. "Make that 3 against 5, came a gruff voice from the shadows. Old Pete Henderson emerged into the light, carrying a buffalo rifle that looked older than the territory itself. Then more figures appeared from the darkness, displaced ranchers, townspeople who'd lost everything to Western Development Corporation's greed, families who'd been driven from their homes by Morrison's violence. Within minutes, the deputy and his remaining men found themselves surrounded by more than 20 armed citizens. "Seems the odds have changed a bit," Tom observed mildly. Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, but the distinctive sound of 20 rifles being cocked simultaneously made him reconsider. His men looked nervously between their boss and the growing crowd of angry settlers. "This isn't over, McCarthy," Morrison snarled. "You're right," Tom replied. "It's not. Tomorrow we ride to Cheyenne. All of us. We tell the territorial governor exactly what Western Development Corporation has been doing, and we don't leave until justice is served." As dawn broke over the Wyoming prairie, Tom McCarthy stood on his porch watching the last of Morrison's men disappear over the horizon. Behind him, Maria nursed Isabella, while dozens of determined families prepared for a journey that would change the territory forever. The blanket that had saved Maria and Isabella, Sarah's blanket, now covered them both as they slept peacefully in the morning light. And for the first time since his wife's death, Tom McCarthy smiled, knowing that her final gift had been not just the truth about her love, but the courage to build something worthy of that love. The failing ranch would become a beacon of hope, the broken widower would become a leader of men, and the Mexican woman who had whispered truth in the darkness would become the mother of a new community built on justice, courage, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of shared struggle. 6 months later, Tom McCarthy stood before the territorial legislature in Cheyenne, his weathered hands holding a petition signed by over 300 families. Beside him, Maria Vasquez held Isabella, now a healthy, laughing baby who had become the unofficial mascot of their movement for justice. The Western Development Corporation had been disbanded, its corrupt officials facing federal charges. Deputy Morrison sat in a territorial prison, his badge of authority replaced by iron shackles. And across Wyoming territory, families were returning to reclaim the land that had been stolen from them through fraud and violence. Tom's ranch, once dying and forgotten, now buzzed with activity as displaced families worked together to rebuild what had been destroyed. The main house had been expanded to accommodate Maria and Isabella, who had become not just residents, but the heart of a community that stretched across 3 counties. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children were asleep, Tom would sit on his porch with Maria, watching the sunset paint the endless sky in shades of gold and crimson. Isabella would sleep peacefully in her arms, wrapped in Sarah's blanket, the same blanket that had saved her life and changed the course of history for an entire territory. "Do you think she knows?" Maria would sometimes ask, her dark eyes reflecting the dying light. Tom would nod, understanding without explanation. Sarah knew. Somewhere beyond the veil of mortality, his wife was watching the legacy of love she had died to preserve bloom into something greater than either of them could have imagined. The widow's blanket had become a symbol of hope throughout the territory, proof that one small act of mercy, one moment of choosing compassion over self-preservation, could kindle a fire that would burn away injustice and illuminate a path toward redemption. And in the growing darkness of each Wyoming evening, as families gathered around their rebuilt hearths and children fell asleep to the lullabies of mothers who had been given hope, the ghost of Sarah McCarthy smiled, knowing that her final journey to Santa Fe had indeed broken the cycle of abandonment that had haunted the McCarthy name for generations. Her husband had found his purpose. Her sacrifice had found its meaning. And love, as she had always believed, had proven stronger than death itself.